thank you very, very much for coming to this very unusual occasion to have Dr. Samantha Power, currently Special Assistant to President Barack Obama, here. The occasion is the Vera and Donald Blinken lecture, which has been held pretty much annually over the last several years, and which brings to Columbia University distinguished practitioners, statespeople, who also have an interest in European affairs. And in that framework, we've had Thomas Pickering, Holbrooke, Senator Biden, when he was then senator, Lord Patton, Christopher Patton, former governor of Hong Kong, and last year Nicholas Burns, just after he retired from the State Department. So it's a wonderful sequence of people, and tonight somebody quite new to all of this, Samantha Power. So let me just introduce Samantha Power. She, Special Assistant, she runs the Office of Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights in the National Security Council, and she's also a professor of practice, the Anna Lynn Professor of Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And that's, if you want, just the most recent accomplishments. Let's go back somewhat further. Samantha Power was born in Ireland and grew up in the U.S. and was educated at Yale and at Harvard Law School. And early she worked as a journalist covering some of the most difficult wars, Bosnia, civil war in Rwanda, writing for various publications in the United States and elsewhere, and it was on the basis of that work that she partook in the myriad debates arising in the 1980s and 90s over the meaning of humanitarian intervention. In her book, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2003, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, she criticized strongly the Clinton administration for its failures in Bosnia and Rwanda, and urged the United States to develop a new calculus in foreign policy, very different from the old realism, but also from the new realism, which could be the new realism meaning you could do nothing or unilaterally send in the Marines. Working with its allies and international organizations, America's leadership, in her view, had to ratchet up its international engagement commensurate with abuses on the ground. This book is a canonical text for students here and human rights at Columbia, but it's also been very much debated. Subsequently, she strongly opposed the war in Iraq as unilateral and not dictated by the interests of the Iraqi people's welfare. And out of the Iraq war came her extraordinary next book, Chasing the Flame, about the Brazilian diplomat, impassioning Sergio Vieira de Mello, who died in the explosion of the UN center in Baghdad. Okay. And that, too, was a reflection in many ways about an extraordinarily beautiful and capable man on a mission, but also on the UN's humanitarian and state-building capacities. Now, after working for the Obama campaign in 2008, Samantha Power has become an advisor to the president, one of his close advisors in a very fraught moment. I should just say, by way of conclusion, before introducing briefly Donald Blinken, in whose name this lecture has been founded, you don't get Samantha Power by simply saying, oh, hey, come on up, we're at Columbia, we're waiting for you. We asked her at least a year ago, not knowing all that would be coming about. We recognized her in her a new kind of statesman, or I should say stateswoman, or state person, a passionaria, who subscribes to the words of advice she gave at one point graduating students at Santa Clara Law School. Let's reason be your tool, but let justice be your cause. Before Samantha speaks, let me introduce Donald Blinken, who, with his wife Vera, former ambassadors to Hungary, he educator, benefactor of the European Institute here at Columbia University, and he will want to say a couple of words.
Thank you very much, Vicki. That was very, very succinct and to the point. I want to congratulate you on organizing this very interesting and important event. I also would like to welcome all of you here on behalf of Vera and myself to what promises to be a very interesting, I think, and important evening. I just want to clarify one matter. As Vicki mentioned a moment ago, we invited Samantha here many months ago. But it's not true that she's been plotting ever since to have an uprising throughout the Middle East and North Africa as a result. That's a rumor I'd like to dispel. So there we are. We're very, very grateful to her coming up from Washington today. It's enormously busy, complicated, and interesting at the White House at the moment. And for her to take the time to come here and talk to all of us, I think is a really great tribute to Columbia and to the School of International Affairs. So without further ado, Samantha Power.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's great to be out of Washington. And it's wonderful to see. I look out and see a lot of friendly faces, which is also a lovely side benefit to being in New York and to being at Columbia. And it's a special honor to be delivering the Donald and Vera Blinken lecture. I first met Donald and Vera Blinken when I was a cub reporter in the Balkans, being mentored by Mort Abramowitz, a friend of the Blinkens. And I got to know Vera on the board of the International Rescue Committee, and welcome George Rupp and George Biddle are here from IRC. I feel like I know Don and Vera better than I actually do because of all the time I get to spend in the Situation Room at the White House with their son, Tony Blinken, Vice President Biden's chief foreign policy advisor and one of the most important members of the Obama foreign policy team. There are no more decent human beings in the world than Tony Blinken, and I have it on good authority that we have his parents to thank. So even though I don't leave the office much in my current job, it seemed well worth making the trip up to New York for the Blinken family, and of course for Columbia University, where my father, Edmund Burke, is currently, I think, taking 5 classes a semester as a lifelong learner. So he's putting the rest of us to shame in terms of the amount of knowledge he's cramming in to a short period of time. I know a lot of you have Libya on the mind. Many have Libya on the mind. I certainly have Libya on the mind. I'm not going to talk much tonight about Libya. President Obama is giving a major address to the nation, and I learned long ago never to give a speech on the same topic as one of the greatest speech makers in the history of the world. I know many of you have questions about Libya, and I assure you that President Obama will answer most of those questions tonight. Now, I will touch upon it, but it will not be my focus. Instead, I will spend my time with you describing President Obama's broader approach to the promotion and protection of human rights and democracy, an approach that is deeply rooted in today's global context. So before I get into the human rights and democracy approach, I think it's worth recalling the world that the President inherited in January 2009 when he took office. It had a number of striking features. First, the transnational challenges that we faced and face required the enlistment of other countries in the solution, whether terrorism, climate change, non-proliferation, the refugee flows and other humanitarian calamities that exist, or even just the need to maintain and bolster the 40-plus multinational contributions to the war in Afghanistan, Virtually every problem that one looked at internationally was going to require stepped up international cooperation and burden sharing. Second feature, of course, was a global recession and extremely high unemployment at home. There were a huge number of foreign policy, high-stakes foreign policy challenges that awaited this administration, this president. An unstable situation in Iraq as we drew down our forces and as the democratic experiment there stabilized. The war in Afghanistan, growing violence and extremism in Pakistan, Iran's attempt to acquire a nuclear weapon, and its brutal stifling of the democratic will of its people. Tensions on the Korean Peninsula, which have only grown more pronounced, etc. Moreover, part of this global global context was that a growing share of the global GDP and growing political assertiveness was being exercised by emerging powers, emerging democracies, but also countries like China. And in terms of human rights promotion and protection specifically, I would add 2 points to this context. First, that the language of human rights and democracy had been tied up and associated with the war in Iraq and other post-9/11 issues and the fight against terrorism around the world. In addition, the so-called responsibility to protect norm had emerged and indeed had been embraced by the UN General Assembly in 2005. But there were few takers in terms of enforcement of that norm. It was one thing to state a responsibility to protect, another thing to exercise it. So that's just the backdrop, just bringing people back to January 2009, which feels a long way away. Much of what I've described, of course, is still very much with us today. But that global context, I think, is important by way of prelude to the approach that the President has taken on human rights and democracy in particular. So that approach I would structure in the following way. First, the President set out, of course, to restore American standing in the world, and he has spent the last 2 years laying out a human rights framework and elaborating on how he and his administration see human rights and democracy in the 21st century. And he has used his pulpit and a number of speeches, which I will refer to kind of clear the brush that had gathered around the norms in previous years, rehabilitating some of the principles and clearing up old associations. This, I think, has had two effects. First, the words democracy and human rights have come to acquire meaning and content that Barack Obama and his administration provided. These are kind of amorphous terms, and people project onto them all kinds of meaning. And I think the fact that he has set out, again, to fill out that content himself has offered some clarity. Second, I think his success in rehabilitating these norms or providing that content has actually made it easier for other governments to stand with us, not just on human rights issues, but on other issues as well. And I'll come to that later when I talk about emerging democracies. So what is this clearing of the brush and reinvigorating of these norms? What exactly are we talking about? Well, the President has argued consistently that our values and our interests can't be easily separated. In his Nobel address, he said, "There has long been a tension between those who describe themselves as realists or idealists, a tension that suggests a stark choice between the narrow pursuit of interests or an endless campaign to impose our values around the world. I reject these choices," he said, and this is a theme that he will strike as well tonight in his Libya address to the nation. As he presses for human rights and democracy and political reform, he has long made a pragmatic case to other peoples and other governments around the world, stressing governments that protect these rights are ultimately more stable, more successful, and more secure. He's also made that pragmatic case to domestic audiences, saying, quote, "Those who defend these values for their people have been our closest friends and allies, while those who have denied those rights, whether terrorist groups or tyrannical governments, have chosen to be our adversaries." so that there is a correlation between the places where reform and rights take hold and the advancement of our interests and the advancement of our peace and security. Now, his first tool in, again, sort of setting out his own path on democracy and human rights was recognizing that human rights had to begin at home, and that his first task and the administration's first task was to try to strengthen the power of our example, as he puts it, our own struggle to perfect our union. Here, of course, he set out to ban torture, to return to the Geneva Conventions, and to close Guantanamo, which of course has proven very challenging. He also renounced the imposition of democracy by military force. This, again, I think is an important part of the clearing of the brush that went on. There was an association because of the war in Iraq between the word democracy, the notion of democracy promotion, and the Iraq invasion. He said in the Cairo speech, memorably, no system of government can or should be imposed by one nation by any other. And he also broke, I think, important ground by pledging to respect the results of elections, provided they are peaceful, and the winners govern with respect for all their people. So a willingness to engage with governments, even those with whom we disagree. So that's first thing, is that it's sort of a clearing of the brush rooted in our own practices and our own relationship to democracy and human rights. But another part of this reinvigoration, I think, has been insisting on a more inclusive conception of what human rights and democracy promotion entails. And here I would start by pointing to the emphasis that the President consistently places on the centrality of human dignity. And this is something that he feels very, very strongly about, and he has spoken about dignity in the context of the dignity of work and the dignity of opportunity, the dignity of peaceful protests, and the right to be able to assemble freely and raise your voice, and of course the dignity inherent in being able to vote for one's own leaders. I think a curious twist on dignity is that he has spoken not only in terms of individual dignity, but also in terms of the need to show respect to cultures and nations, and so a kind of respect also for the dignity of nations and for communities. Again, famous phrase, mutual interest, mutual respect. He's made clear that democracy is more than elections, rule of law, independent media, judiciary, vibrant private sector and civil society. He has stressed institutions and the need for strong institutional foundations. In the Ghana speech, of course, saying Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions. And I think one of the most interesting uses of President Kennedy's many great quotes came in the Nobel address when the President referred back to Kennedy's line, "Let us focus on a more practical, more attainable peace based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions." So figuring out, again, how to strengthen those institutions, even if that's going to mean evolution rather than revolution in human affairs. And, of course, the President has emphasized the link between freedom from fear and freedom from want, the two Rooseveltian ideas, giving a greater emphasis to economic development in foreign policy than I think we've seen in generations. We have, of course, in Tunisia seen a revolution sparked by the economic frustrations of a fruit vendor, and thus see just how true it is, the connections between economic suffering and economic struggles on the one hand, and political repression, and a need for outlets to advance your economic and political destiny. Secretary Clinton in this domain spearheaded the introduction of a brand new tool to discipline the government and to ensure that economic development gets the attention that it deserves. The U.S. government had long set priorities in something known as the Quadrennial Defense Review, or QDR, but she introduced the QDDR, which is the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. And again, the president here has been very clear on the interlinkage between economic security and opportunity on the one hand and civil and political rights on the other. Additionally, in terms of this more thicker conception of human rights and democracy, the president, I think, has spoken from his own experience, that of his family around the world, and with an eye to the experience of millions living in the developing world, with his insistence that corruption is, in fact, a profound assault on human dignity and indeed a human rights violation in and of itself. Secretary Clinton has highlighted corruption for the first time systematically in the annual U.S. human rights reports, which had tended to focus mainly on civil and political abuses. And that, again, I think is related to an emphasis on economic opportunity, but also an understanding that your dignity is so violated when somebody stops you and it's such a, and asks for a bribe. It's such a fundamentally coercive act and such an impediment to political as well as economic development. So finally, in this brush clearing exercise, the president has, of course, and you've heard a lot of this lately, has stressed that change, lasting change, sustainable change, is bottom-up and indigenous. Most of his and the Secretary's statements on events in the Middle East stress this point, a belief that the United States isn't going to dictate the way history turns in these societies, that what makes what we have seen on television so inspiring in many respects is the degree to which people are claiming their own destiny. Nor, of course, does this administration believe that there's one model for change. As the president said back in Cairo, each nation gives life to the principle of democracy in its own way. Grounded in the traditions of its own people, America does not presume to know what is best for everyone. And then at the UN General Assembly, his first address, he said, each country will pursue a path rooted in the culture of its people and in its past traditions. Now, again, this deference to bottom-up change and to indigenous movements and the importance of sustainability and so forth is not a recipe for the United States, standing on the sideline or being indifferent to human rights and democracy. And the president has long coupled, I think, this respect for other traditions with a challenge to developing countries to take responsibility to fix homegrown problems with a degree of bluntness that one doesn't always see in public addresses in other people's countries. He said in the Ghana speech, the West is not responsible for the destruction of the Zimbabwean economy or wars in which children are enlisted as combatants. No business wants to invest in a place where the government skims 20% off the top. And for just as it is important to emerge from the control of other nations, colonialism, the decolonial pride that people, post-colonial pride that people feel, it is even more important to build one's own nation. So it's very much an emphasis on responsibility, bottom-up change, and the need to not to scapegoat, but to take ownership of one's own community and society. And at all times, amid this deference and respect for different traditions, the president and the secretary and the administration have come back time and again to their confidence, though, in the universality of human rights, that not only do the international instruments, speak to that universality in terms of how many countries and peoples have embraced those instruments, those norms, but just a deep belief that all people just share certain things in common, certain yearnings in common, and that they yearn for certain things. And those things are not Western values. It's not Western values that would cause the people of Libya to risk their lives on the street. They are not these values are not the monopoly of one country, as the president said in Moscow. And wherever possible, I think you see the president and the secretary kind of grounding reference to human rights and democratic principles in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in the Geneva Conventions and so forth, recognizing that these are not us sort of projecting our values, but that they're, again, in a bottom-up way over a period of time, these are values that have been expressed in all countries at all times. So this is, I think, just the framing for, I forget what the title of the speech is, something like Obama, Human Rights, and no, I remember the rest of the speech, but just not the title. Obama, Human Rights, and the New Diplomacy. So this is kind of, I think, at least tries to capture his worldview. He captures his worldview in this string of speeches, and I think there's a freshness to a lot of what I've described, and I think it has resonated in corners of the world that had become skeptical over time and remain skeptical in certain respects, but that this emphasis on dignity, the emphasis on justice as well, the invocation of universal rights, the respect for other traditions and for the kind of zigzaggy journeys that others will go on, the reckoning with the U.S.'s own practices and so forth, and the attempt to get our own house in order and strive for a more perfect union. I think there has been real resonance in these messages. But what is the new diplomacy then? What are the diplomatic and policy implications of the framework that I've described? Well, one place to start would be the President's UN address of just last September, where he laid out an agenda around open economies, open society, and open government. And I will say a little about each of these things because each has policy implications. But one of the things that's very striking about this framework is it's an attempt to find a new point of entry, to find a fresh way at a conversation where a lot of people around the world have their minds made up. There's a fair amount of polarization in the international system around human rights and democracy. And so to come at this debate from the standpoint of open and closed, and to supplement the broader human rights and democracy conversation, I think was an interesting step forward. Open economies, within the international community, there had long been regional group solidarity, creating a false division really between civil and political rights and basic freedom on the one hand and social and economic welfare on the other. As I've mentioned already in describing the President and the Secretary and the whole system's attention to development, I think that emphasis has helped bust through that division. But again, the administration has emphasized the connection between open economies and political freedom, stressing, for instance, in the Middle East, how limited the economic changes that will come about will be without the kind of political decentralization that's required. The argument is often made in the other direction that is also true, that of course, if you're starving, having a perfect constitution isn't going to get you very far. But very important to recognize the impact of political decentralization and political empowerment on economic development. Open government is also, I think, a fresh and important concept. Of course, began with the President's own domestic open government initiative, the publishing of the White House visitor logs, the giving greater transparency to the assets of government officials, et cetera. Attempts to speed the processing of freedom of information requests and other things. Internationally, I think this recognition of the link between transparency on the one hand and accountability on the other, and better governance then flowing from transparency and accountability, has led to some I think very compelling initiatives in this space in order to strengthen international norms against corruption and improve governance. This administration has worked within the UN, the G20, the OECD, and the international financial institutions to promote the recognition that corruption is a violation of basic human rights and a severe impediment to development and to national security. Again, often corruption, at least a generation ago, was seen as an impediment to us getting the most bang for our buck in terms of international assistance. But to frame it as something that's relevant, again, for individuals around the world, I think is very important, and as something that has to be mitigated before you're going to see kind of lasting change in institutional development. So we've worked with governments and with civil society organizations to bring greater transparency to government budgets, to expenditures, and to the assets of public officials. We are trying to institutionalize transparent practices in the international aid flows, also not only for the taxpayers to see where U.S. assistance is going, but also so that recipient countries and peoples are able to track that. Similar transparent practices around banking and tax policy, and private sector engagement around natural resources to make it harder for officials to steal and make it a little bit easier for citizens to hold their governments accountable in terms of natural resource flows. We are seeking to enlist emerging powers, who again I'll talk about in just a minute at greater length. But here you see countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, really Mexico, doing tremendously interesting work in harnessing new technologies to promote better governance, to bring citizens into the conversation, into a more collaborative relationship with government, or even more adversarial relationship with government. But transparency being used, new technology being used to strengthen that connection and again, improve performance. The third dimension of the UNGA speech was open society, and here Secretary Clinton in particular has been very much out in front of the effort to strengthen civil society around the world. The administration has practiced, I think pretty consistently again, across departments and agencies, what we like to think of as dual track engagement. Normally dual track means, you do, well, you know what dual track means, but one version of dual track is not only that officials meet other officials, but that civil society meet civil society, and our officials, when we go abroad, don't just meet with people who wear badges around their necks, but also seek out citizens and organizations and bloggers who are often not in the most collaborative relationship with those governments, and indeed who in some cases are the people who've just been locked up by the governments. But this kind of standing guidance that you've got to get out beyond statist circles, I think, is an important defining new dimension of Secretary Clinton's leadership at the State Department. And it's permeated across the board. Secretary Gates, when he was in Egypt last week, had a meeting with a group of civil society activists, and you're seeing more and more those kinds of meetings occurring, and they're themselves, of course, a window into feedback on, or they're themselves a route to receiving feedback on U.S. foreign policies and on our performance in these countries. Secretary Clinton has also launched a new fund to provide legal representation to human rights defenders who are unjustly imprisoned for doing nothing more than speaking up for the rights of their fellow citizens. Working within the Human Rights Council at the UN in Geneva, we were able last year to join with several untraditional partners who we had, traditionally sort of struggled to team up with in international institutions to respond to a pretty distinct and disturbing moment in time, which was a spike in crackdown on civil society around the world, a real shrinking of the space in which journalists and non-governmental organizations were able to do their business. And taking note of this moment, we joined with these other countries to create the first ever international mechanism to monitor the crackdown on civil society, basically to track it country by country. And this is a new special rapporteur for freedom of association and freedom of assembly. One of Secretary Clinton's signature initiatives, which I'm sure many of you know about, is, of course, promoting internet freedom, recognizing that one of the most potent enabling rights is the right to connect and the right to access information. I was just thinking as I was flying up here, just the global outrage over Egypt's shutting off of the internet, which now feels like it was sometime back in the 1970s. But when they shut down the internet, the outrage around the world, just the idea that you could have an on-off switch and shut it on and off. Obviously, other governments are sophisticated in their ability to censor and to stymie internet use, but something as dramatic as that, and then the global, again, sort of revolt against that shutdown, I think indicates to some extent just how potent this kind of right to connect norm has become in a very short period of time. And obviously, we recognizing that new technologies are fueling people-powered movements around the world and shining a spotlight on human rights abuses, allowing people to upload what's happening in their neighborhoods, in some of these very challenging environments today. We are channeling programs and trying to support the dissemination of technologies to facilitate this free expression and to expand access to information, increase the transparency, and counter the many, many restrictions that are developing on use. So this is the kind of the new point of entry, or a new point of entry, is to go at this through an open government lens, through an open society lens, through an open economy lens, having laid out that broad set of principles and filled out the meaning of the traditional human rights and democracy language. The third thing that this administration has done with the president's leadership is invested in the multilateral system generally and the human rights architecture specifically. President Obama has said, in an era when our destiny is shared, power is no longer a zero-sum game. And we see this at work in a range of policies across a range of issue areas, from non-pro to peacekeeping to counterterrorism, et cetera. But when the president launched his so-called era of engagement, he was seeking to invest in an international system so that the system itself would do a better job of delivering global public goods, and so that there could be more burden sharing, so that we in the United States could rebalance more and tend to the home front where there are so many needs. Now, there are many examples of the sort of exercise of the decision to engage the international system in a new way and in a very aggressive way. But those engagements that touch upon democracy and human rights, the subject of this talk, include the decision to engage the flawed Human Rights Council, which I'll speak about, to engage the Alliance of Civilizations as an observer, and to re-energize the community of democracies, which has not yet reached its promise. I'd just like to say a few words about the Human Rights Council, which is kind of became the poster child for what was wrong with the UN system and wrong with the way that human rights were promoted, in particular in the UN system. The Council, of course, has long given disproportionate attention to Israel, while slighting human rights abuses in powerful countries like China. And in addition, its proceedings, if any of you have ever had to witness them, have often seemed divorced from the suffering of the real world. It wasn't very nimble when bad things were happening in the world. The kind of old debates from 10 or 20 years ago were resurrected and impeded even holding special sessions or drawing attention to abuses that were ongoing. And we knew all about all of these flaws, and I think we're quite clear-eyed back in 2009 about how much work it would take to really change the council and ensure it worked better for real people. But President Obama, Secretary Clinton, Ambassador Rice, and others felt strongly that it was we'd be far better off trying to fix the Human Rights Council from within. In addition, we didn't really have the luxury of just writing off the UN's main human rights body. I think they anticipated also that just the active engagement, and this is something that's kind of inchoate and hard to quantify, but actually just being seen to engage in good faith and to sit down with others and roll up your sleeves and try to find a consensus path forward actually creates a kind of some amount of goodwill that we can draw upon in other settings. And we've really seen that. Ambassador Rice has long described the sort of spillover effect from Geneva to New York, and vice versa, frankly, because of the way she engages here. So this was the sort of logic of engagement. It was the era of engagement meeting the era of responsibility, as the president liked to say. And here we are a couple years into our tenure there, and while the flaws that I have mentioned still remain, and one cannot sugarcoat what goes on in Geneva, the downside of what goes on in Geneva, I will say that we have just completed what I think is the most successful 1 month stint in the Human Rights Council's history, arguably even in the history of the Human Rights Commission that preceded it. And I'll just run through a few of the things that we've managed to do with our partners in Geneva, some of which you actually read about. The proceedings of the Human Rights Council don't normally make headlines, but because of the Libya events, the Council's been more in the news than usual. Together with a broad cross-regional set of partners, we succeeded in creating a special rapporteur to monitor human rights abuses in Iran. Now this is, again, doesn't sound like that big a deal perhaps, but it's the first ever country-specific special rapporteur created by the Council. And the reason that those country-specific positions are so hard to create is that in the developing world, countries feel very strongly that we shouldn't single countries out, that that's an interference in internal affairs and in sovereignty and so forth. Now, Iran's crackdown and so forth made our argument easier to make in this context, but I also think that some of those habits and some of those divisions that have paralyzed the Council are breaking down a little bit as people recognize, outside Western circles, that you have to call a spade if human rights abuses are occurring and a vote comes up. You have to take a stand one way or the other. We just Friday created a commission of inquiry for Ivory Coast, where there has been a really worrying spike in violence the last 2 months. Of course, you have two claimants for the presidency, one who was democratically elected and the other who lost and who's holding on to power. So the creation of a commission of inquiry at least creates the specter of accountability, as the individuals around those two leaders, increasingly are prone to take violent measures in order to achieve their political destiny. And we were, of course, trying to tighten the screws diplomatically, and the commission of inquiry, I think, is a part of that, showing that there will be a price to be paid, both in terms of stealing an election and in terms of any of the violent acts that would be carried out before the political situation is resolved. Now, for Libya, as I mentioned, we also created a commission of inquiry. To some extent, that achievement was overtaken then by word that the UN Security Council had referred the crimes in Libya to the International Criminal Court. But again, what made Libya quite extraordinary is the Council came together, held a special session, an emergency session, where you need some number of signatures in order to get an emergency session on the books. Again, those are few and far between. And made the decision both to create this commission of inquiry in advance of the ICC referral and, as you know, to expel, for the first time in the history of the Human Rights Council, one of its members, namely Libya. The Human Rights Council made that decision, then the decision was passed on to the General Assembly, which the following week did indeed decide to suspend Libya's membership. So this, again, this is the Human Rights Council, a venue that we're using more and more to do traditional business. I mean, this advanced the U.S.'s foreign policy aims in the moment. It isn't just a small sort of boutique location where human rights concerns are raised and rejected. It's a place where we were able to use some of what the Council offered as a way of compounding the Gaddafi regime's diplomatic isolation in the early days of this crisis. So thanks to American leadership and I think some encouraging signs from regional leaders in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, we're starting to see the Council do real foreign policy business and real work on behalf of human rights. I don't want to overstate the progress. It is steady, I believe, but it is also slow, and we have a lot of work to do. But there's no question that the President's decision to seek membership, I think, has been redeemed by the ways in which we've been able to use it as a tool for human rights promotion and protection, and a broader tool, I think, to signal to the rest of the international community that we're back, that we do want to roll up our sleeves, that we do want to try to build bridges, even on some of the most tense and polarizing issues in the international system. Now, the general attitude toward the United States in the United Nations has warmed, of course, in the last couple years. There's a much more congenial, not perfect, we don't get to script everything, but a more congenial negotiating environment than the one that we inherited in early 2009. I'll just give you one statistic that I think is quite telling. In 2008, the United States was the only no vote on more than 30% of the resolutions that came before the UN General Assembly. In 2009, we were in this position only a single time. So from 30% to just a single vote. And in 2010, there wasn't a single instance in which the U.S. voted no in isolation on a resolution. Now, this represents sometimes a change in the U.S. position, but more than that, it represents a willingness to get in and try to shape the text of these resolutions before they come to a vote, or frankly, to get other countries to join us in opposing resolutions we don't like. But I think it was noteworthy that 2009 saw the largest one-year shift in voting coincidence with the United States since voting began back in 1946, and that pattern has continued into this year. So that's the kind of multilateral approach, a recognition that multilateralism is not a luxury in a world with all these transnational challenges, and in a world where our military and our diplomatic capital and our financial capital is very overstretched, but it's a necessity, and it requires systemic investments and not just a la carte investments in the multilateral system. The fourth dimension of the President's approach to human rights protection and promotion is the enlistment of emerging democracies in the cause of human rights promotion. And when President Obama took office, the number of democracies in the world had grown in the previous 2 decades from 69 in 1989 to 119 in 2009. However, the number of countries talking about and supporting democracy and human rights bilaterally and in these international fora had remained quite static. The same kind of faces, the same group of countries were still pressing the human rights cause, in part because, again, the polarization of the debate that I've already referred to. We have made a concerted effort to try to get to try to work with emerging democracies and to bring them into the business of human rights promotion and protection. Most of the trips that President Obama has chosen to take in his first 2 years highlight the role for and embrace of emerging democracies and regional democratic anchors. So some of the countries he visited, of course, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Brazil, Chile. I mean, he's seeking to highlight the values that are enjoyed at home and seeking to use these trips in order to bring these bilateral partnerships into more meaningful joint regional and multilateral action. Specifically, he's appealed to those countries that have really stepped up in the G20 to take on more economic responsibilities, now to also take on enhanced political responsibilities in the international system, with trying to encourage a greater willingness to step up to contest threats to international peace and security, and of course to stand up for those who are suffering human rights abuses. One of the most memorable, I think, sort of illustrations of this effort on the President's part came again in his UN General Assembly speech, where he drew very deliberate attention to the kind of disconnect between the values that some emerging democracies, that emerging democracies by definition enjoy at home, but that some of them were not injecting fully into their foreign policies. And he issued an appeal. He said, "I appeal to those nations who emerged from tyranny and inspired the world in the second half of the last century, from South Africa to South Asia, from Eastern Europe to South America. Don't stand idly by, don't be silent. When dissidents elsewhere are imprisoned and protesters are beaten, recall your own history." And then this is my favorite line, "because part of the price of our own freedom is standing up for the freedom of others." And this was, in front of the heads of state from many of the countries where this disconnect has been evident. In our work together on the Human Rights Council, Indonesia, South Africa, and Brazil have expressed skepticism that I referred to earlier about country-specific human rights promotion policies. So what we've done is worked with them, partnered with them first on more general global human rights concerns, such as the Special Rapporteur I mentioned for freedom of association and assembly. We created together a new mechanism to combat discrimination against women, and I think a groundbreaking cross-regional statement calling for the end to violence against LGBT persons. And this just happened actually last week in the same Human Rights Council session. It shouldn't be radical to get a statement like that, but to get 85 countries in the international system to sign on to an LGBT statement is significant, and I think, again, a move in the right direction. We have also sought, again, in the spirit of bringing these emerging democracies on board, to enlist them or to seek them out early in the process, rather than kind of having something that we want their support for, and then kind of jamming them at the end, sort of basic diplomacy, I guess. But they had the sense that they were often an afterthought, and we are really seeking to come up with ideas with them about how we can collaborate. And the only way that you kind of get some of the progress that I've described, modest though it may seem, is by engaging not just in the international institution itself, not in the multilateral fora, but at a very high level in capitals. So making sure that, you know, very senior officials, whether the president, the secretary, the vice president, are calling and trying to close the deal and secure the cooperation when it matters. We also engage them, and I think this is important and easy to forget, recognizing that we are not the only ones who have domestic politics to contend with. Over time, I think that the governments in emerging democracies are far more likely to inject human rights concerns into their foreign policy when they are held accountable domestically for ignoring human rights abuses. And this is sort of a basic statement of the obvious about foreign policy accountability, but many of these countries are still consolidating their democratic gains, and the checks and balances domestically aren't yet necessarily as focused on foreign policy. And it's worth recalling that in the United States several decades ago, it was the Congress that pushed the executive branch to consider human rights and began restricting funding streams on human rights grounds. It was U.S. civil society and U.S. constituents who, it remains in fact U.S. civil society and U.S. constituents who hold all of us in government accountable, not just for our policies at home, but for our actions abroad. And similarly, in these new democracies, we recognize that it's going to take time for parliaments, civil society, and media to turn outward. We have seen some interesting examples, though. For instance, the Burma caucus in Indonesia's parliament has played an important role putting the fate of Burmese on the political map in Indonesia, and they've shown, I think, some interesting leadership within ASEAN. We've seen a bottom-up letter-writing campaign from Brazilian citizens to press the previous Brazilian President Lula to offer asylum to the Iranian woman who'd been sentenced to be stoned to death. We've seen countless campaigns, of course, by investigative journalists, bloggers, Facebook users, pressing human rights causes at home in these democracies, and it just does seem like it's only a matter of time where you're going to start to see those same tools used to impose the kind of accountability, again, that we live with cheerfully every day in this country. In Indonesia, which has 13,000 non-governmental organizations, in the spirit of trying to encourage this outward orientation, the United States has launched a new initiative pledging to fund those groups, those local domestic groups who are interested in working in the region, interested in taking what they've learned through going through this journey from dictatorship to democracy, you know, if they have insights and best practices that they want to share with their regional colleagues. So I think getting the emerging democracies, ensuring that the coalition of countries who are promoting democracy and human rights is a broader coalition is incredibly important. Fifth and finally, the President has, in terms of his overall approach to human rights policy, he has made an unprecedented commitment to preventing mass atrocity. And again, he's going to be speaking to this tonight. But Libya is the most high-profile case in which this administration has opened up its toolbox and deployed a range of diplomatic, economic, and judicial accountability and Commission of Inquiry and other tools. And, of course, when it was clear that 10 days ago or whenever it was, that those tools would not be enough to prevent the fall of Benghazi, a town of 700,000 people, the president mobilized an international coalition on behalf of military measures to protect civilians. To put the Libyan events in some historical context, that's kind of, one thing about having written about mass atrocities is to see what this administration has done and then put it in this historical context. It took more than a year for the international community to impose asset freezes on those responsible for violence against civilians in Bosnia, and actually 2 years to impose travel bans on those individuals who were involved in violence against civilians. In Libya, it took us 9 days to impose asset freezes and travel bans. In the Balkans, it took 3 years, of course, for the international community to intervene with air power to stop heavy weaponry firing on civilians and prevent further atrocities. And in Libya, it took a little more than a month. But this commitment by President Obama to this goal is not new. Even in his Cairo address, this part of the Cairo address I hadn't actually even remembered until I went back and read it recently, but he generated fierce applause when he challenged countries in the Muslim world to recognize that the slaughter of innocents was what he called a stain on our collective conscience, and there he referred to Darfur and Bosnia. In his Nobel speech back in December 2009, he said, in many ways foreshadowing, I think, the speech that he will give tonight, quote, "I believe that force can be justified on humanitarian grounds as it was in the Balkans. Inaction tears at our conscience and can lead to more costly intervention later. That's why all responsible nations must embrace the role that militaries with a clear mandate can play to keep the peace," end quote. He has also taken a number of concrete steps inside the bureaucracy, which may be of interest only to me in this room. But those steps actually make it more likely that we can prevent atrocities before they escalate to a scale as they did in Libya. He established, with little fanfare, the first ever White House position dedicated exclusively to coordinating policies on preventing, identifying, and responding to mass atrocities and genocide. The president recognized that the task of preventing genocide was an achievable goal, but one that would require governmental organization and engagement that resembled the intensity and efficiency of those who were intent on carrying out mass killings. So at the National Security Council, we have this new position, and it's made a world of difference. We have a new director, no longer new, now there for more than a year, but an NSC director for war crimes and atrocities. He's definitely the worst job title in government. And I've had the privilege of being with him when he hands his business card to foreign leaders, which is even more fun. But this individual, who's named David Pressman, spends his days looking for early indicators of potential atrocities, developing high-level political strategies to respond to those indicators, and he helps coordinate the enlistment of international partners in this effort. And one of the things we're hoping to mobilize is the appointment in other governments of similar sort of points of contact or similar individuals, where you can have a kind of quasi-red phone between individuals who are really looking at the early warning signs of mass atrocities. But from the NSC, which is the coordinating mechanism for the government, his presence has made a world of difference, bringing the intelligence community, the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, the State Department, the Defense Department, et cetera, together to make sure that we're using mainly non-military tools in virtually all cases in order to deter atrocities again before they escalate. In January, thanks largely to the intensity and fervor of U.S. leadership, the people of Southern Sudan were able to vote for independence in relative peace, and we are now working to try to prevent violence and atrocity in advance of the Southern Sudan's expected independence this summer. On Darfur, of course, we haven't yet seen the progress we seek, but I can tell you personally it's not for lack of trying. And we continue to hold the Sudanese government accountable for its attacks on civilians and to invest substantial diplomatic and other resources in pursuing a peace that could allow the people of Darfur to live with the same basic rights and dignity as their neighbors in southern Sudan. We believe that this, too, is an achievable goal, if a very challenging one. In conclusion, President Obama has set the United States on a new course, taking account of an altered global context. He has restored U.S. standing, replenished the U.S. commitment, and filled out the U.S. commitment to human rights norms, given meaning to what he and his team mean by human rights and democracy promotion. He has embraced a series of policies aimed at promoting open economies, open society, and open government. He's invested in the multilateral system, recognizing that especially when you're acting or speaking out on behalf of universal human rights principles, you'll be more effective the more universal your coalition is. So the more countries you have by your side, the less daylight there is in the international system, and the less of a likelihood that a country committing human rights abuses can play countries in the international system off against one another. In that spirit, he has worked to enlist emerging democracies who we feel are natural allies in the long term on these efforts, and he has sought to prevent mass atrocities that would eclipse progress in other human rights areas and stain our collective conscience. We obviously have a long way to go in the cause of human rights promotion and protection, but the President, Secretary Clinton, and the rest of his cabinet, I think, have charted a course that we are confident will, over time, help bend the famous arc of history toward justice. Thank you. Thanks.
We have the opportunity to take some questions, which I will be moderating, and they are written questions. That is not uncommon practice when we're dealing with public officials. So it's my understanding that paper has been distributed and questions have been raised, and I guess what I'm going to start with one. Should we do this? Should I maybe? Well, okay. Anyway, let me start with one.
Okay.
Which is, where do you draw the line as where and when to intervene when protesters are being killed or threatened? Is it just a matter of sheer numbers? And again, what is the magic number that unleash R2P, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, or is it the ease of a clean, in quotes, for Westerners' military mission? No Western casualties as opposed to, say, to another Mogadishu.
Okay. Go ahead. Take that. Well, I think that the one of the things that's important to do is define again the sort of idea of intervention, which in Libya began with diplomatic, economic, judicial, arms embargo, a whole series of tools that, again, in prior cases, our lament in many instances was not that the United States should have sent military force into another country to try to stop atrocities, but the lament was we didn't do the little things. We didn't do didn't take the diplomatic steps, didn't denounce, didn't make calls at a high level, didn't expel ambassadors, didn't tighten the diplomatic noose, didn't try to locate and freeze foreign assets, didn't do radio jamming, didn't. That was the story of the prior cases. So I think when there are human rights abuses, and certainly when people are being killed, whenever one person is killed by a government, the U.S. has a foreign policy with that country of some form, with a couple exceptions out there. We have either an embassy on the ground or we have some way of expressing ourselves and taking a stand on human rights abuses. And so on that continuum of intervention from the soft side to the much more robust and very rare and needs to be very rare side, there are a whole series of steps I think that can be taken. Again, it's not a situation where there is a magic number. I think in the case of Benghazi, the track record that Muammar Gaddafi had amassed, both over the last 4 decades, in which on a single day he executed 1,200 people simply on suspicion of disloyalty, and the reports that we've gotten from the towns that he's overrun, and the flattening of apartment buildings, and the denial of medical care, and all the rest, and the special role that Benghazi, the special importance of Benghazi in the rebellion. I think that our best judgment was that what would have happened had that town been overrun would have been extremely chilling, deadly, and indeed, again, a stain on our collective conscience. So I think what distinguished Libya was the fact that there was an international mandate, a UN Security Council authorization, which President Obama feels was very, very important to have. There was a coalition that included Arab states from the region and some of our closest NATO allies that were willing to share the burden of attempting to protect civilians, and there was the potential for such a horrific scale that it meant that having tried other tools in the toolbox and having seen events on the ground kind of outpace those tools, the decision was made to move to the more robust side of the spectrum. But I think it's very important to remember, and this is what we're doing in Ivory Coast and what we did in Sudan in advance of the referendum, again with our international partners, to remember just how many tools there are short of military force, and how much more desirable it is to use those other tools given the risks and the costs associated with military force.
Okay, last question. You spoke about open economies and political freedoms. Can you discuss? I'm so sorry. Yes. Pardon me here. Yes, this is from a Columbia SIPA School of International and Public Affairs student. Could you, speaking of open economies, and political freedoms, can you discuss U.S.-China relations?
Sure. Just like that.
There are a couple of other that are more or less pointed, but in that direction. Okay. So.
Okay. Should I leave now? I guess. Well, I don't want to I get into this too much, but I will just say that that part of what we're doing every day is trying to balance a whole number of interests at once. One of which is the one that I spent 45 minutes talking about, which are the human rights interests. And I think you heard during the summit when Hu Jintao visited the United States just how prominent the human rights concerns were in that visit. My dear friends Laura and Emma from Human Rights Watch are here today. Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch was not only present at the state dinner, but we seated him next to the Chinese ambassador to Washington. And we used also the knowledge that the summit was coming, was on the horizon, in order to press the Chinese government to do more on Sudan, because just as it happened, the referendum was on January 9th and the summit was about a week later, 10 days later. So again, using the fact of the summit to draw greater attention to the plight of political dissidents and ordinary Chinese who are unjustly incarcerated, and also to take note of the importance of China stepping into a very different kind of role in Sudan, where they haven't always been a constructive player. But we saw much more outspokenness and much more leadership from them on Sudan in a way that I think made actually a real difference. So in terms of the political freedom, open economy, I mean, if Geithner were here, he could do the open economies part of the answer. But I think what we've seen in the last few weeks is very, very disturbing, and already grim human rights situation has deteriorated as the Chinese government appears to be fearful of the Arab Spring spreading and some of the tools that have been used in places that, and against regimes that once seemed untouchable, that those tools would get used again. So we're stepping up our diplomacy on human rights grounds and maintaining the security and the economic and the other dialogues that are critical also for our national interests.
A couple of questions. Well, the gist is presented here by Ben Smith from Politico. Could you comment on the recent reports of a boys versus girls rift inside the administration?
Didn't you say there was a second question?
Yeah, well, it may be related. Okay.
Oh, that's all right. We can. I will comment only to say that that the stories are completely inaccurate, utterly untrue, distorted, unhelpful, bad reporting. That's it.
Well, let's follow. This is an interesting question posed by a graduate student at Columbia. Has Obama considered, or would he ever consider, using the language of human rights to advance his domestic agenda, for example, around health care?
It's a good question.
It's a sweet question.
My others, like Ben, who covered the campaign, may have a better memory of this than I on the domestic side, but or my parents who are physicians, but my memory is that the president has, in fact, used the human rights framework and talked about a right to health care, and indeed that was one of the framing, sort of the approaches that he took in the campaign and beyond, culminating in this historic legislative achievement. So my sense is that he has done that.
Mm-hmm. And this sounds like lead you out on more on questions of the significance of women's rights and their protection for American foreign policy and international humanitarian strategy. There are a couple of questions that are.
No, it's a great question. I'm trying to remember now when it was. About a year ago, Secretary Clinton went up to the UN Security Council and made a pledge that we would pull together a national action plan on women, peace, and security. And we're very much in the thick of preparing that. It means bringing, again, all the different agencies and departments together around that cause. It means thinking about famously mainstreaming, women's protection issues and so forth, but also changing the way we are structured as a government to ensure that we're responsive and that we undertake kind of prophylactic measures as well. I mentioned in the atrocity and genocide context the difference that having just a single individual working with me at the White House has made in our ability to do atrocity prevention. I mean, it's really, really significant. Just again, a small investment of human capital. So too, at the State Department, the fact that we have Milan Verveer, as the designated individual who's in every meeting, and she's got a wonderfully forceful personality and such vast knowledge. So in the policy process, she's in every meeting pressing to get these issues on the agenda. She's traveling globally to convey U.S. Commitments in this regard. I mean, I think, again, for the President, for the whole Cabinet, for Admiral Mullen, Secretary Gates, they've all spoken about this so often, but they view women's empowerment as a matter for national security. That ultimately when you have women who are politically participating, when they're not under threat either to domestic violence or to violent conflict, societies are more stable, more secure, more successful, all the things the President mentioned earlier. So we're working on this National Action Plan. We're trying to bring the resources together, and we're trying to multilateralize the agenda, including getting, of course, UN peacekeepers to take sexual violence, violence against women and children far more seriously.
A question about why has there been no, about the administration's response to the crackdown in Bahrain, and whether you would advise intervention there.
Well, again, I just come back to the same point from before, which is that intervention, I think, is an unhelpful way of framing things because it lumps together a phone call from our DCM, our deputy chief of mission, to a local Bahraini official on the one hand. That's a diplomatic intervention. To the creation of a no-fly zone in Libya. That's another form of intervention. So I think we have not been silent. The President, Secretary, National Security Advisor Tom Donilon have not been at all silent about the crackdown in Bahrain, issuing very critical statements and working tirelessly at all levels to try to get a political dialogue restarted, which has become, of course, more difficult the more the violence has taken hold. But it's an area of huge focus, again, for the entire administration. And the fact that we have our 7th Fleet based in Bahrain, actually, has given us even more avenues to be raising the concerns that we have and to be pressing for political dialogue, pressing both sides, both the government and the opposition.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there are some questions that regard civil rights in the U.S. One that discuss the questions around the Guantanamo closing and how the administration has dealt with that. Not that specifically related, but about the civil rights of American Muslims and how the administration has been dealing with attacks on their freedoms. Then the third about the abuse of Bradley Manning, Private Manning. So all three questions which are related to domestic.
Well, I would just say on the Guantanamo closing issue, just that, again, as the President said in his signing statement of the National Defense Authorization Act, we're, he is still intent on finding a way to close Guantanamo. It's the domestic climate is very, very difficult, of course, on that issue, and there have been now restrictions that are imposed that are making it very challenging to follow through on the plans that were made. But as you heard again a few weeks ago when we rolled out the new executive order and when military commissions were being restarted, the commitment to Article 3 trials remains every bit as strong as it has always been for this president. In terms of Bradley Manning, I would just say again that we have full confidence in the Defense Department and in the facilities and the protections that he's being afforded. In terms of the civil rights of Muslim Americans, I think this has been a huge priority at the White House, not just from the President, but also Deputy National Security Advisor Dennis McDonough just gave a major address on this issue. He's worked very closely with John Brennan, the President's counterterrorism advisor, and again, there are huge efforts to reach out and to try to promote tolerance in our own country, recognizing, as I said in my remarks, that that this struggle at home and this quest for the more perfect union is ultimately our most potent weapon in promoting human rights and protecting human rights abroad. So I would just refer you to Dennis's speech, which lists a range of initiatives that this administration has undertaken in this regard.
Okay, take a couple more questions. One has to do, and this came up in a couple of questions, about whether the administration is, how it's using economic development tools effectively, especially in Africa, whether the use has changed with respect to previous administrations.
I'm not myself sort of present on the back end of the policies, but I know that the prime emphasis is on so-called country ownership, and basically not having a one-size-fits-all model developed in Washington or developed for one country and then applied to another country, but really trying to ensure that the policies are granular and that there are feedback mechanisms where citizens and civil society can offer, constructive commentary on how U.S. programs are actually affecting real people. So I know that's the philosophy of it. I can't speak to what actually, to particulars of country situations.
Last question coming from an historian or a PhD candidate in history. What contribution did humanitarian interventionist or humanitarian interventionism make to the launching of the Iraq War in 2003? Did humanitarian interventionism, on balance, facilitate the war or deter it?
What I will say, again, in my current job, it's not necessarily reflecting on past historical events. It's not necessarily what I'm here to do, but what I can say, I guess, is just that make the obvious point that the administration, the Bush administration, gave a range of justifications for going to war in Iraq, and I think different individuals within the administration at that time were motivated by very different things. This is always the case, and you're surrounded by people who come with very different perspectives and backgrounds, and sometimes their policy motives diverge, but their policy judgments converge and overlap. And so I think there were individuals in the Bush administration who were very motivated by the plight of Iraq's people. There were people who were motivated by the weapons of mass destruction allegations and so forth. There were people who were motivated by 9/11 and the pretty fragile sort of connect the dots to that, but it was something that motivated individuals. So I think that the motives are varied, and those sort of strands came together and convinced the president, who I think was probably motivated by all of the above and more. And I guess what I would say is that once the war in Iraq started, because the welfare of Iraqis quickly deteriorated, it also took on, the U.S. military took on heroically, really, the task of trying to protect Iraqis and strengthen security so they weren't as vulnerable to attack. So in that sense, while I think the precipitant was not primarily humanitarian, it may have been for, again, an individual or several individuals, but over time, the U.S. military had to become, in a hurry, skilled at providing humanitarian assistance. Once the international agencies and the UN and others withdrew after some of the terrorist attacks in late 2003 and 2004, the United States took on some of those humanitarian roles, and honestly, has capabilities today that it didn't have back then, but is also, of course, very overstretched by having, and many families have done multiple tours for having, maintained a presence in two conflict areas over time, which again is one of the reasons that the president is so mindful of the costs and the downsides of military action, and so determined to ensure that the scope of the Libya action is limited in duration, and that we very quickly move to a support role, because there are many countries who, in NATO and beyond NATO, who are willing to take on this larger burden going forward. So why don't I leave it there? Thank you all for coming.